This is the first of two lectures entitled Plato's Phaedrus, Eroticism and Dialectic. In this lecture, we'll look at Plato's Phaedrus. We'll do a close reading of some of the key passages from the text, and we will explore the way in which eroticism plays a role in propelling the dialectic in Plato, and how eroticism is construed in Plato as an essential part of the soul, as we've discussed previously when we looked at Plato's metaphysics in the lecture on Timaeus. So again, we've talked about how the soul has three parts: the psyche, Eros, thymos, epithymia, or Eros, and each part of the soul is essential. And so we'll find Socrates in this dialogue very careful not to stigmatize Eros. One thing that is kind of confusing for many new readers who come to this dialogue is that they when they look at this dialogue and they listen to the speech of Lysias, that Socrates is going to comment upon, and that Phaedrus, who is Socrates' interlocutor, will read for him after he pulls it from his tunic. It's because it's a written speech. It seems that Socrates is agreeing with Lysias and with Phaedrus, but then later he's going to totally change what he says and completely reject the speech. So at first, you have to be kind of careful to be aware of that. Now, in the Timaeus, we saw that Socrates was essentially a passive host for the two guests that did all of the talking essentially in that dialogue. In this dialogue, Socrates takes a much more active role, and this dialogue is far more characteristic of the dialogues of Plato. This is a very interesting dialogue, and again, as I've said previously, it is essential for students of literature. And as we're going to see, the basic situation is that you have a young man named Phaedrus who's very handsome, and he is essentially kind of a love triangle, as we'll see, between Socrates, Phaedrus, and Lysias, who both seem, at least at the beginning of the dialogue, to be competing for Phaedrus's attention, and it leads into an interesting discourse on love and the nature of Eros, and how it is essential in dialectical discussion and philosophy in a more general sense. All right, though, before we go more deeply, oh, by the way, that's you can see there an image there of Eros, the wanton boy. Also known as Cupid in Roman mythology, same deity in effect, and Aphrodite in Roman mythology, Venus. These figures are going to loom large in Apuleius's The Golden Ass, which I view as one of the most essential texts to understanding the historical development of the soul or the concept of the soul in Western civilization. That and perhaps Augustine's Confessions, which was directly influenced by the earlier text of Apuleius, The Golden Ass. As we're going to see, one of the reasons why Socrates fears Eros is that if the wanton boy Eros strikes you with one of his arrows from his quiver, you're going to do crazy, foolish things, and you're not going to be able to really control yourself. Even Zeus, the father god of the pantheon, is prone to being struck by the arrows of Eros, and finds himself doing foolish things because he is struck by these arrows. So too the mother of Eros, Aphrodite. So nobody is immune to love's arrows, or to Eros's arrows, as we will explore. All right, but before we get too far into this dialogue, I want to draw attention to some key historical dates to put this dialogue in historical context. Okay, as you can see here, I've got some key dates, and we'll return to some of these in the second lecture when we talk about the development of literacy in ancient Athens. We might note here the Trojan War, which is the subject of the Homeric epic, the Iliad. Also, the Odyssey is said to have taken place sometime between 1260 and 1180 BCE, or before Common Era, or about 1200 years before the time of the birth of Christ. 3,200 years from where we are at this particular point in history. But it's not until the late 900s and early 800s that the Homeric epics come to be composed, because this is also the point at which literacy enters into Hellenic civilization. Prior to that, of course, we have the bards who perform these epics, and the word epic itself means voicing. It's going to be an important thing to remember. For many decades and decades prior to it becomes formalized as a inscribed text. So the voice, as we're going to see, is going to be very important to Plato as well. And we're going to see how much ambivalence he feels for the introduction of this new technology, the technology of writing that comes into his society, and which sends it into some to upheavals in some sense, much like the upheavals that we've recently gone through with the introduction of electronic media in our society, and the internet. It totally changed everything in ancient Athens, and Plato has a kind of love-hate relationship with literacy. You can see here, note some other dates. The so-called pre-Socratic thinkers, I've put some rough dates here, 550 to 400. And I know, Heidegger, for instance, really doesn't like this word pre-Socratic. He finds it a kind of a monstrous formulation, but we'll use it because it is commonly used out there. It's those thinkers who aren't necessarily, some of them preceded Socrates, some of them were his contemporaries, but what they all have in common is they're Greek thinkers who are thinking prior to the advent of Platonic idealism, and before Aristotle formulates many of the basic concepts of metaphysics in his metaphysics. And so these are some of these thinkers are the thinkers, for instance, that Heidegger will find to be more originary than Plato. He already sees in Plato kind of a symptom of decline in Hellenic civilization. But I note in passing also that in the Hellenic tradition, we should always bear in mind that poetry precedes philosophy. Derrida is going to call philosophers a sorry lot of poets. Interesting way of putting it. But I've said to you from the very beginning that we're studying these texts as literature, and there is a sense in which philosophy really does come out of literature, and the poetic is perhaps in some ways more central to the development of Western civilization. Poetry like Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, than philosophy. So I just note that in passing as something to come back to and something to think about. One thing we might also notice is that the founding text of Western civilization, the Iliad, is in fact an epic of war. And so that tells us also something about how deeply warfare itself is inherent in our civilization. It's a problem we still have with us today, obviously. Some of the thinkers that we're going to be referencing here, Gorgias is associated with the Sophist tradition. So too is Lysias, who becomes kind of an evil figure of some sense, a comically evil figure in this dialogue of Phaedrus. But Lysias was a real historical personage, as well as a character in this dialogue, as was Gorgias, and Plato has a dialogue on Gorgias as well. And then it's focused on this question of sophism, which is a competitor with the Plato's Academy, the Sophist, for many students in Athens at that time. Euripides, the playwright who wrote the Bacchae and other really interesting plays, as well as figures like Sophocles. Of course, many people feel Sophocles, the author of Oedipus Rex, is perhaps an even more important Greek tragedy, writer of Greek tragedy than Euripides. I find Euripides to be wonderful myself. And we're going to be, in my class on animal metamorphosis, we're going to be looking at a play by Euripides on Dionysius. So you can see there, and then I note here, if you look, you see these dates here, Socrates 470 to 399. I put these in succession, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great, because you can see generationally how one figure is followed by the other. And whereas Socrates is the teacher of Plato, Plato is the teacher of Aristotle, Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, who then went out and conquered the world and disseminated a lot of the teachings of Greek philosophers throughout much of the ancient world at that time. For instance, to give you a sense of Alexander the Great's importance on both sides of the Mediterranean, he's mentioned in the Quran, in many of the, let's say, Timbuktu manuscripts from the medieval period. He's often referenced as a kind of a Islamic saint. And in part because he does play some role in disseminating these very important and founding philosophical texts. Okay, year zero, Jesus Christ. If these dates are accurate, who knows? But the tradition that's handed down to us, these would be the rough dates, and we can see Paul here, the Apostle Paul, who is going to disseminate Christian thought, but refracted through a Platonic lens. It's important to note, and we'll return to that question later. And then John, who is the author of the gospel that is not one of the synoptic gospels, but the gospel with what's called, the highest Christology, who in his gospel is going to, conflate the Greek concept, the Greek Platonic concept of the Logos with the historical personage of Jesus Christ, and thereby completely transform our understanding of it. And so in some sense, when we think of Heidegger, one of the things Heidegger is going to say that's kind of interesting is that he calls Martin Luther one of the first thinkers who did deconstruction. What he means by that is that, Luther sought to peel back the sedimented layers that had accrued to Christianity to kind of recover an understanding of the apostolic church, prior to this long history that developed when so many different, theological concepts came to be associated with Christianity. So Luther wanted a kind of a more, pristine Christianity, or at least he wanted to recover what Christianity might have been in the period of the apostolic church, the first, let's say, 100, 200 years of Christianity and its existence in the West. Heidegger, in some sense, is the reason why you can say, well, Luther and Heidegger, both Germans, are doing something very similar, is that they're both seeking to, to recover a thinking, that is prior to the history of either, in the case of Luther, Western Christendom, in the case of Heidegger, even prior to Plato. So he's returning to these originary concepts to recover a thinking of Greek civilization, prior to its Christianization. So this is something that we can look at, and I think that you'll find interesting, whatever your own personal beliefs are. Apuleius, the author of The Golden Ass, who I just mentioned, who offers a really interesting history of the birth of the soul in Western thought. Augustine, perhaps the most important theologian who synthesizes Platonism and Christianity for the West. He's Berber philosopher from North Africa. And then Muhammad, who is some 600 years after Christ. And I mentioned Al-Kindi here, who is a translator who translates the Plato and Aristotle into Arabic. And so that for this reason, the thinking of Aristotle and Plato will go forward into North Africa, the Middle East into the Arabic-speaking world, as well as in the West. So these are just a few key dates and figures to bear in mind as we continue this historical investigation. All right. So here are some key terms at the beginning of our study. The term sophism. This comes to be a stigmatized term in the thinking of Plato. Again, the sophists were competitors with Plato for students in the academy, and we're going rather quickly here because we have limited time to dwell too long on these concepts. But these are terms that you should know about. And sophism is generally associated with figures who were teachers who taught the young men of Athens in its emerging democracy to become persuasive speakers or persuasive rhetors. And this is what the word rhetoric means. A rhetor is a speaker, and rhetoric is in reference to the speaking arts. Now, it's interesting today, for instance, in many English departments, rhetoric is taught as a matter of written discourse, of how to organize your thought in compelling ways so you can persuade others to come over to your point of view. Lawyers, for instance, will study rhetoric as well. But it's important to note that in its more originary meaning, it does refer to the gift of speaking and as a kind of a skill that one can acquire. So that it's not merely a gift, but a practical skill that one can learn by going to teachers like Gorgias and Lysias. And so, in this dialogue, and there you see the person on the second bust on the left, the man with the beard, that's a bust of Lysias, who, as I said, was an actual person, an actual sophist. And you can see, again, in this dialogue that we're studying, he's the one that Socrates is competing with in his attempts to lure Phaedrus to learn in the way that he thinks that he should learn this method of dialectics. And to be cautious about what Lysias is teaching him. I mention here this other term because I've used this word in reference to Chomsky and Peterson in previous lectures, demagogue, and so I wanted to provide some clarity on what that term is, because it's in some sense linked to what we're studying today. So demagogue, and this is a standard definition of demagogue. A demagogue is a political leader who appeals to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people rather than by using rational argument. Now, Pericles, who is the figure you see on the far left, was considered to be a kind of the kind of Donald Trump of his era, in the sense that he was a true demagogue during the period of the Peloponnesian Wars that Thucydides discusses in his wonderful history of that period. And he does things like we've seen recently, for instance, since this is in some sense a kind of a coronavirus lecture series, we've seen just yesterday, I was reading an article where Donald Trump was being criticized for calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus. Well, this is perhaps one way of deflecting attention from the fact that he didn't do a whole lot to prepare for the coming pandemic that we're now undergoing. So by calling this virus the Chinese virus, it's a way of stirring up prejudices of the ordinary people. It's not a particularly rational argument, but many demagogues through history have found it to be a useful political strategy. And I note that here because as many people, it's worth noting that there's nothing new about demagoguery. It's a very old dimension, very old practice in human society. But the two figures here, I've called both Chomsky and Peterson, who you see images of here, demagogues as well. And we'll look later at some of their arguments. But precisely because, for instance, in the case of Jordan Peterson, he tends to stir up ordinary people, the common public, and their sentiments against the university and against deconstruction, for instance, against Derrida, against many of these key figures who have been influential in articulating these more contemporary theories that have been so influential, not by actually reading the texts of Derrida, not by actually reading the texts of Foucault or carefully analyzing them, but simply by, name calling, referring to Derrida as an evil joker, and Chomsky does the same thing. And so these are not rational arguments. These are ways of appealing to people's fears. Okay. By contrast, Socrates, I might note, begins. I'm pulling out a quote here from the very beginning of the dialogue, where he positions himself as a kind of an ignorant philosopher. He professes his own ignorance. This is crucial to understanding of the Socratic method or the Platonic dialectics. And here's what Socrates says. He says, "I am well aware that I myself." Excuse me, I dropped a word there. It should say, "I'm well aware that I myself know nothing about these things, conscious as I am of my own ignorance." And so he begins not by professing his knowledge, but by professing his ignorance. Now, this is inductive. This is an inductive procedure, as opposed to, as we're going to see later, a Cartesian procedure. Cartesian thinking begins with the assertion of a thesis. That the person who makes the claim is standing in a position of certainty. Socrates is not standing in a position of certainty. He's standing in a position of uncertainty, of unknowing, of ignorance. And this is why this is precisely why he asks questions, not because he knows, but because he doesn't know. And through the process of asking questions, he hopes to discover the truth. I think I note here below Plato's dialogue, The Apology, where you can find in Socrates' own words a narrative where he describes how this method came into being. And it's a fascinating story that he offers there in this Apology. And this is when he's standing trial for, he's accused of having corrupted the youth of Athens. And he defends himself by saying, "Look, when I was, and this is giving you a short version of the story." He says, "When I was young, I wanted to learn from the excuse me, let me pull up this image here. I wanted to learn from the best teachers that I could find." And so he sought to find teachers from whom he could learn. Now at this time, that's essentially what you would do. I mean, these were the universities of the time. As you just follow around somebody who had a particular kind of knowledge. You'd stay with them for as long as you felt that you were learning something from them, and then you'd move on to another teacher. And so Socrates went to the Oracle of Delphi, and he asked the priestess there, who's the wisest person in all the land from whom I can learn? And the priestess told him, "Well, Socrates, you are." And this came as some surprise to him, because he knew that he didn't feel himself to be the wisest person in all the land, or the most knowledgeable person in all the land. But he spent some time thinking about it, and he finally came to the conclusion that the one thing that he knew that nobody else seemed to know or be aware of, that nobody else seemed to be aware of, was that he didn't know anything, and everybody else walked around, claiming that they knew something, and so he would just go up to people and ask them questions, and this is one of the reasons why he made so many people angry at him, was because his questions would eventually reveal the ignorance of those who claim to be standing in positions of certainty or positions of knowledge. This was very irritating, and to the people of Athens. And he describes himself as a kind of a gadfly, somebody who's trying to spur people on to to think a little bit more, deeply. But the people of Athens didn't appreciate this, and as of course we all know what happens at the end of the Apology is that Socrates was in effect sentenced to death. But there would be no Socratic method at all, no dialectic at all, unless Socrates were standing in a position of not knowing. If he took the Cartesian view, philosophy itself could not have been born, or at least Platonic philosophy, Socratic philosophy could not have been born. So I think that's important to be aware of. Okay, so the other word here, we're going to work on these words and these terms and Plato's understanding of them. But the other word here is philosophy. I just want to pause on this word for just a moment. You can see there it's a combination of two words. Sophos, same root of the word in sophism. And this was in reference to wisdom, whereas philia is in reference to love. We've been talking about Eros as a form of erotic love. Philia also means love, but it means brotherly love. And so we're going to have this contrast between brotherly love and erotic love. And one way of understanding this dialogue or coming to terms with this dialogue is by focusing on this distinction. Because whereas Lysias is going to be seeking to win the sexual favors of Phaedrus and engage in erotic relations with him, Socrates, as we're going to see, does have sexual feelings for Phaedrus, but he is going to be more interested in this brotherly relationship in fostering a kind of a brotherly relationship with Phaedrus. And so one way of thinking about philosophy is it's a matter of brothers gathered together, brothers who love one another, gathered together in the pursuit of wisdom. Right? Let me say that again. Brothers who love one another, gathered together in the pursuit of wisdom. Now the term brother, fraternity, is obviously a gendered term. We've already seen, though, that the philosophical tradition in the West is a Phono-logo-centric tradition, so that shouldn't surprise us. But this is a question that we'll come back to also in our when we look at Freud's totem and taboo. This question of fraternity and its relation to philosophy and the emergence of democracy as well. Okay. All right. So I'm going to let me start by let's start by trying to get some kind of understanding of the argument of Lysias. So here's the basic situation. We've said Lysias is a sophist, and Phaedrus has just come from his company, being in his company, and he carries with him, hidden in his tunic, a written speech of Lysias. And this written speech of Lysias is something that Phaedrus is quite excited about, and he wants to share this with Socrates. And so Socrates and Phaedrus are taking a walk out of the city, and they're talking about this speech, and Phaedrus tells Socrates that he would like to share it with him, and Socrates says, by all means. And so Phaedrus pulls it out of his tunic, and he reads it to Socrates. Now, we won't go into every aspect of this written speech, but I pulled out a few key passages here to examine to get a sense of what Lysias is saying. You can return to the text and look at the speech for a longer, more fuller understanding of it. But here's basically, and this is the actual. I'm citing from the actual text of Lysias, and the situation is that Phaedrus is reading this text to Socrates, and here is the argument. Lysias says, when lovers lose their passion, they come to regret whatever goods they have conferred upon one another. What he means by that, sexual favors. Lovers certainly agree that they are sick rather than of sound mind, and they realize that although they are thinking poorly, they are powerless to do anything about it. how can these men, once they have regained their lost senses, possibly continue to hold those beliefs which they had in the grip of love? Okay, so let's note there a couple of things. One is that Lysias is, criticizing people who are in love precisely because they're not rational. They've lost control of their senses. And it would seem, we would think, well, why wouldn't that be something that Socrates would agree with or Plato would agree with? Because we've seen already that the psyche is intended to be our rational faculty, which has to control our sense of appetite and desire, as well as our thymotic courage. So it would ostensibly, it would seem to be a reasonable argument, but Socrates is going to find a problem with this. So again, he's criticizing lovers for being literally out of their mind. They're sick rather than of sound mind when they're in love. And so basically, Lysias' friends with benefits argument is one of the things that we have going for us, you and I, Phaedrus, is that we don't love one another, and so we can engage in sexual relations and not do all of the crazy things that lovers do and suffer from our madness, or the madness of lovers. And he's going to say, well, look, and besides that, everyone finds out about lovers. It's inevitable when they see lovers following after their loves and doing anything for them. And then he notes, but no, and so, people are going to gossip. But he says, but look, nobody dreams of finding fault with non-lovers for their rendezvous, knowing that such talk is necessary for friendship or some other pleasure. So in effect, because we don't love one another, we just are going to have sex with one another and enjoy ourselves in a physical way, that we're not going to arouse any gossip from the people that we live among, because we're not going to be doing the foolish things that lovers do. That people are going to think we're just talking with one another, and they won't assume that we're lovers because we're not out of our minds. And he notes further, non-lovers would never be jealous, whereas passion clouds the judgment of lovers. And then finally, a key passage here: non-lovers are not weakened by love, but in full possession of themselves. And this is something that important point to note, because someone who is in love suffers from a kind of a mania, is not in possession of themselves. And Socrates, we're going to see, doesn't necessarily disagree with this, but he's going to have a different response to this dynamic. Okay, well, after after the speech of Lysias is read by Phaedrus, Socrates is going to listen to it, and he's going to, say, okay, fine. And then he's going to himself, Phaedrus kind of goads him into saying something further, to giving his own speech on the speech of Lysias. And Socrates does give a speech. And this is where, as I said earlier, this source of confusion may come in, because it seems that Socrates is agreeing with what Lysias says. And indeed, he does in this brief speech that he gives, echoing the speech, the reading of the speech of Lysias that Phaedrus performs. But then he's going to repudiate it. But at a certain point, as he's giving his own speech, Socrates starts to become very excited, and he starts to speak in almost in a kind of a frenzy. Now, part of the reason why he is excited is quite simply because he's sexually aroused by the close proximity of Phaedrus. And this sexual arousal that he experiences is not something that is insignificant. It's quite crucial for Plato and for understanding how dialectic rhetoric functions, because what we're going to see is that what Socrates, and then of course Plato via Socrates, is going to say is that desire, remember, desire is a part of the soul. Sexual desire, appetite is a part of the soul, an important part of the soul. It's just that it has to be held in check. And so, for instance, when we think of, well, what is Platonic love? Platonic love, often it's popularly thought of as just, people say, well, are you two dating? Are you two having sex? He says, no. Oh, it's Platonic. But what Platonic really means in this sense is, well, we would like to be having sex. We're sexually attracted to one another, but we're not acting on that sexual attraction. And it's the energy from that sexual attraction that causes Socrates to feel excited, and it's precisely that excitement that literally gets the wind blowing, gets him speaking in a way that he's almost in a kind of a frenzy. Now, here's a kind of an irony for us to reflect upon, considering the fact that this lecture is being delivered via an internet or electronic media, where I'm essentially sitting here staring at a computer screen, and you're wherever you are staring at a screen. This would be very strange to Plato, and he would probably not approve, because Plato is all about presence. This is what we're going to be calling the metaphysics of presence. That for dialectic to happen, for philosophy to take place, bodies have to be gathered together in the same place, so that one might inspire one another, spur one another on to the pursuit of truth. But as we're going to see, not acting, feeling that sexual attraction for one another, but not acting upon that sexual attraction. So that's essential to Plato's thought. This is what Derrida, for instance, is going to call sort of the orgiastic secret within Platonic thought. This is a question which he's going to say, for instance, in his little book, The Gift of Death, that this is a problem in Christian post-Christian Europe, or Christian Europe, which has not been properly thought through, because the eroticism has a complicated and difficult ambivalent place within a Christian society, and this was not obviously the case for Plato, who felt that the erotic was essential part of our very soul, our immortal soul. All right, so here you can see an image of this kind of love triangle that develops between the three lovers. Here is Socrates. He's not a particularly handsome fellow, as you can see on the left. He was sometimes referred to as the dog-faced philosopher. And this on the right is Lysias. The lover that they're competing for is Phaedrus. This is not actually Phaedrus, but this is just a bust of a young man in Athens. But here, this gives you kind of a sense of what these people look like, and note that Phaedrus was obviously much younger than both Socrates and Lysias, and this was part of their attraction to him, because they saw in him as a more perfectly, in a temporal sense, that he was more beautiful in a way that they, as aged fellows, were no longer quite as handsome as he was, and so it's partly for that reason that they're drawn to him. Okay, I'm going to go back here just a minute. All right, so I want to quote here from the speech where Socrates says to Phaedrus, here's the words of Socrates. He says, "My dear Phaedrus," this is when he starts to get aroused. He says, "Do I seem to you, as I do to myself, to be caught in the grip of divine passion?" And Phaedrus says, "There's no question, Socrates. A most uncustomary fluency has seized you." And Socrates says, "Then keep silent and listen. Don't be astonished if I frequently become nymph-possessed," as the speech continues. And so he's almost speaking in poetic meter at this point, because he's so aroused by what this conversation that's happening, this dialogue, this exchange that's taking place between Phaedrus and himself. But all right, now here's where I note that I would note here that after he gives this, after he gives his own sort of false speech, he starts to feel like there's something, I don't feel good about this. I don't feel right about this. There's something that he's very uncomfortable about, and after having given it, he feels a certain malaise. And his sort of, he says, his sort of demon steals upon him. Now, Socrates, Nietzsche talks quite a lot about Socrates and his demons, or his demon, and so Socrates was reputed to be like, if he would get stuck in some kind of philosophical conundrum, he would just stop and stand in place until his demon came to him. Now, demon, as Heidegger points out, Heidegger's going to associate demons in Greek thought with what he's going to call modalities of being. And so this is an easier way to say this, a more popular way to say this would be mood. A demon is like a mood. So he has to wait. His mood, in effect, what happens is that the demon, it's not like a demon like in The Exorcist where Linda Blair starts twirling her head around and spewing out, green stuff. It's rather his demon is his mood has changed. He was excited. He was saying the speech and suddenly something feels wrong. And what feels wrong, as we're going to see, is that he feels that he's done offense to the gods, to a particular god especially, and that is to the god Eros, because we've already seen Eros is a god, is an important deity for the Greeks. And let's read what Socrates will say about this. He'll say, okay, he's talking to Phaedrus. He says, just as I was about to cross the river, my good man, that demonic spirit and its customary sign came to me. It always restrains me when I'm about to do something wrong, and I thought I heard some voice all of a sudden which would not allow me to go away before I purified myself, as though I had committed some offense or other against the divine, a crime against God, even before I finished my speech, and I felt shame. Now, I basically going to say I have to wash out my mouth with soap because these words that I said make me feel dirty. He says, let me go back. Now I realize my offense. He says, my speech was simple-minded, even slightly irreverent. Don't you, Phaedrus, believe that Eros is a god, the son of Aphrodite? And Phaedrus gives kind of a half-hearted response because he's still excited about the speech that he heard from Lysias. He says, well, that's what people say, that he's a god. And Socrates responds, well, not so, Lysias. His speech was delivered through my mouth while I was drugged and under your spell. All right, now that's an interesting point that he makes here because we find him in this case saying something very similar to what we'll talk about later in reference to Gorgias and his very famous encomium to Helen, which is, you find out there on the internet. It's very short, and if you haven't read it, you definitely should read it because it gives you a sense of of Greek views about the word, prior to Plato, or the word is a kind of a pharmakon, the spoken word. It's a pharmakon or a kind of a drug. And in effect, he's saying something, very similar. He's saying, look, you, Phaedrus, you drugged me with your presence. You're so beautiful that I was not really, I wasn't really, thinking very clearly. And so I said some things that I don't feel particularly good about. And now I want to rethink what I was just, saying. And so, he says, basically, he says, let me go back. He says, if Eros exists, as in fact he does exist, whether as a god or at least as something divine, all right, we've seen, whether you don't have to, for Socrates, believe that in Greek mythology, in the sense you say, well, he was an actual god, but there's something divine about Eros. We've already seen, we know what that is because it's part of our very soul. He could not be bad in any way, although both speeches spoke just now as if he were. So in this way, they erred about Eros. All right, so the offense is to Eros, or to Cupid, the wanton boy. Where he says it's Lysias's speech, it's as if there's something, wrong in itself about Eros. And is it really true that Eros is this crazy thing called love, to quote what is his name, Cole Porter, is as bad as all that, or is there something about it that's good? Lysias is stigmatizing the erotic, and Socrates is not comfortable with that. All right, now here are some images, interesting images here. You can see Aphrodite on the far left, Eros on the far right, or Venus and Cupid, and in the middle you see Venus and Cupid again, or Aphrodite and Eros, the little boy with the wings there. And there is Pan, the half god, half goat, half man, who is the tutor of Eros. And these are really important figures in antiquity. Aphrodite is the goddess of love, associated with roses or Venus. For instance, on Lupercalia, which was February the 15th, which when it became Christianized, it became Valentine's Day on the 14th of February instead of the Ides of February, the 15th of February, the Christian era. They moved it back so that the two celebrations wouldn't be so conflated, but we still give chocolates and roses and celebrate love on this day. It has very old origins. It's still very much part of our society because we're still human beings. We still fall in love. We still have erotic desires for the other. All right, so here's what Socrates says. He repents of his evil. He says, look, I am in fear of Eros, and he should be. Remember, Zeus himself fears Eros, of what he'll do if he gets struck by Eros's arrows from his quiver. He says, I wish to wash away such bitter and brackish speech with sweet, fresh words. And I advise Lysias as well to write with haste that one must grant favors to a lover rather than a non-lover. For if madness were simply bad, all would be fine. But as it is, the greatest of all good things come to us through madness, provided that madness is divinely given. Now, the word here is for madness is mania. It's like the maniac madness. And so he's saying, look, madness is not really such a bad thing. There are good aspects to it, particularly when it's bestowed upon us by the gods. And he's going to identify 4 different kinds of mania or madness that the gods bestow upon us. So let's just survey them for a minute here. The first is prophecy. He says, the prophetess at Delphi and the priestess at Dodona do many good things for Greece in private and public matters when they are mad or when they are out of their minds. But when they are in sound mind and self-controlled, they do practically nothing for our country. All right, so here's an interesting kind of madness, the madness of prophecy. Also thought of heteroglossia, speaking in tongues, which predates the Christian era as well. And so when one, we think the heteroglossia, speaking in tongues, is associated with Pentecost, but it's also was there in ancient Greece as well. So that when the priestesses at Delphi, for instance, when Socrates went to visit them, or when Oedipus goes to visit them and find out his fate in Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex, they speak, but it's not them speaking. They are vessels through whom the gods speak and deliver truths. And so we have, prophecy. Well, this idea is in the Abrahamic traditions as well, that the prophets like Moses and so on, that when they deliver, the word of God, it's not the prophet himself who is speaking, but God is speaking through the prophet. And so he says, well, that's a kind of a madness, isn't it? And what's so bad about that? Don't we get a lot of good things, from that? Okay. Now, the next kind of madness that he's going to refer to is healing. He says, madness in conjunction with purification and secret rites takes the sick out of harm's way. And so madness has this function as well. And then there is the madness of the muses. All right. This is the madness that poets experience. He says, this madness takes hold of a tender soul. It rouses and fills that soul with a Dionysic frenzy to make lyric songs and other forms of poetry. The madness arranging and preserving the countless deeds of the ancients for the edification of generations to come. Okay, so if you want to know more about this, there's a wonderful little dialogue. It's not very long. It's often anthologized. It's called Ion by Plato. And in this particular dialogue, Plato comes upon Ion, who is a Homeric poet. Which is to say, he's kind of like a griot in the West African tradition. He recites the epics of Homer, and he wins contests because he's very good at it. But Socrates kind of plays around with them because he asks Ion, like he does in all of his dialogues, how are you doing what you're doing? And it becomes clear that Ion has no idea how he's so skilled at doing what he's doing, because when he's doing it, he's in effect, possessed by the muses. And so this is what, musicians, poets, performers, when they perform and they become inspired to perform, it's as if they are possessed. And for the Greeks, they were possessed. And the Homeric epics, for instance, Homer always invokes the muses before proceeding, and he says basically, muses, come and possess me so that I can be a better poet if I'm under your spell. All right, now finally, the most important, the best, the greatest form of madness, he's going to say, the greatest gift that the gods bestow upon us is the madness of erotic love. He says, both for the person who has this madness and for the one who shares in it. This is the very best of all the divine possessions, and it comes from the best source. All right, so this is precisely what Lysias's speech has not taken into account. And Socratic dialectic, the Socratic method does take Eros into account, and it takes it into account very specifically in the pedagogical context. But again, remember, for Socrates, the difference is that, you could summarize this difference between Lysias and Socrates by Lysias basically saying, let's have sex with one another because we don't love one another and we'll just have a nice time and have and experience sexual pleasure. Socrates is basically saying we both are very attracted to one another. We want to have sex with one another, but we're not going to have sex with one another because we're more interested in something higher than mere physical gratification, which is the pursuit of truth. Okay, now another way to say this, if you want to put it in terms of the basic concepts of metaphysics, is that Lysias loves Phaedrus for his appearance, for who he seems to be, and Socrates loves Phaedrus for who he really is, not for his who he merely appears to be. Okay, we make this distinction all the time today in our relationships with others. Do you love a person for who they really look like, or do you love a person, for who they really are? Okay, now in Derrida is going to talk about this in terms of what calls the qui and the quoi, or the who and the what. And there's a wonderful film documentary by Kirby Dick, which I always urge my students to see because it gives you a nice look at who Derrida was as a person. Maybe Peterson and Chomsky should watch that. It'd probably do them some good. But in this film, one of the filmmakers asks Derrida, to talk about love, and he doesn't even know where to begin, and it's too big of a question. But he says, okay, well, let's talk about the who and the what. Do you love somebody for who they are or for what they are? And one of the things we could say is that Lysias loves Phaedrus, for what he is, a physically attractive young man, whereas Socrates is attracted to Phaedrus because, remember, as Heidegger says, for instance, that you have to take on, appearance is something that has to be taken on as a constant urgency. One doesn't dismiss mere appearance, but he also is he's more interested in is he loves Phaedrus for who Phaedrus is, not just for what Phaedrus is or for how Phaedrus appears in the realm of becoming. Okay, now let's review again. This is something I mentioned in our last lecture, a couple lectures ago, when we were talking about metaphysics. This idea of the psyche. Now, we talked about in Timaeus the logos being in the head, thymos here in the heart, eros, epithymia in the genitals, in the belly. But in this essay, we get a metaphor of the chariot, and here, very famous metaphor that's emblematic metaphor of Platonic thought. Here, Socrates says, "Let us liken the soul or the psyche to the innate power of a winged team of horses and a charioteer. A charioteer rules over and guides a pair of horses. One of these horses is noble and good and from like stock, but the other is opposite and from opposite stock." So again, the charioteer, that's a metaphor for logos, our faculty of reason and language. The good horse, the noble horse, this is thymotic horse or figure of thymos, courage, spiritedness, the desire for recognition, which is always sort of sailing to the heavens. And then the other horse, which is from opposite stock. This is the horse of our appetite that's always seeking to make us crash to the ground, but it's a part of our soul. So good thing, we need it. We got to have it to live. We got to have it to reproduce as a species, to experience pleasure and so on, which is not a bad thing in Greek thought. But it has to be held in check by, reason can't let it run unchecked. Okay, and here's another image of this very famous metaphor. This is a figure of the psyche or the soul in Plato from Greek statute. Okay, so let's continue. Socrates says, of the two horses, one stands in the position of greater beauty. This is the thymotic horse, in form erect and well-jointed, high-necked, hooked nose, white to behold, black-eyed, a lover of honor with a sense of moderation and shame, and a companion of true opinion, without need of the whip, ruled by command and word alone. All right, so this is like an animal, like an obedient dog, obedient horse, one that you just need to, just tell them what to do and they're going to do it. But this other horse, crooked, bulky, poorly slung together, stiff-necked, thick-necked, snub-nosed, black-eyed, cloudy-eyed, hot-blooded, a companion of wantonness and insolences, shaggy about the ears, obtuse, and scarcely obedient to whip or goad. And he's going to say, if two friends adopt a more coarse way of life, one that loves honor and not wisdom, okay, and here he doesn't mean honor necessarily in a good sense here. He means honor if you're more interested in honor than doing, than attending to wisdom, that can get you into trouble. You rush into all kinds of trouble. He says, then perhaps when drunk or in some other careless hour, the couple's two unbridled horses will catch their souls unguarded and lead them forward to the same thing, namely to seize upon and carry out a course of action which many consider blissful. All right. In Plato's Symposium, it's essentially also another dialogue about love. It's essentially a drinking party. It's all the philosophers love to drink and party, just like people do today. And often that got them into mischief or into trouble. And when they have carried out this act once, they will continue to do so. In other words, had sex for the rest of their lives, though sparingly, since they do not approve of this with their full soul. Particularly the thymotic part of their soul. When in love and later when out of love, these two also go through life as friends with each other, although not so quite so close as the philosophical couple. Okay, again, I mentioned this earlier, this is what Kant calls rupture. And so this is what Socrates urges that his followers be careful about, because what will inevitably happen is that will lead to a rupture in the relationship. And whereas the two friends who have a sexual attraction for one another, but refrain from acting on that sexual attraction, will continue to associate with one another and continue to love one another, but as brothers rather than as lovers, brothers who love one another. Okay. Now, I've said earlier, we talked, briefly about this, but Plato believed in reincarnation. Now, there's a lot of, in this dialogue, there's a lot of discussion about reincarnation. I don't want to go too far into that in this lecture. I will note it in passing, but what's important for our purposes is that because Plato's belief in reincarnation implies what's essential here is that essentially what he's going to say is that when we were prior to coming into this carnation, when we sort of fell to earth, we were in this blissful realm of being where we beheld, being not through a glass darkly, but face to face. And so we come into the world already endowed with visions of eternity and with these beautiful eternal forms. And so we may have forgotten that we have seen these forms, but we have indeed experience them. This is also probably why Plato's going to say learning is akin to memory. It's as if we remember something that we've already experienced. And indeed, for Plato, we did experience, but we experienced it in the realm of being before we came and were reborn in the world of becoming. And this is going to be linked to this idea that we'll be talking about love at first sight, that when the philosopher, like let's say Socrates, catches a glimpse of Phaedrus and sees his manly beauty, he feels his heart leap out to him, because what he's essentially seeing is a representation of a form that he experienced in the realm of being prior to this carnation. So it's almost like a joyous, like he sees the beauty, and it's this joyous leap that he experiences, almost sort of a leaping out of himself. All right. Well, let's look at how Plato, or through this, how Socrates speaking, describes this. He says, none of the poets here on earth have ever sung the praises of this place beyond heaven, nor will any ever sing of it adequately, although, of course, Socrates is doing precisely that. But the hymn goes like this. This is the place of being, the being that truly is, colorless, shapeless, and untouchable. Now, I mentioned earlier this phrase, the truly existing intangible essence, and this is another translation of this same phrase. And also, again, I urge you, if you're reading, Plato, I like to do comparative translation because you can learn a lot by comparing how different translators translate the same text. So, it's if you're working on these passages and you don't have Greek, you can go back and read what the translators have done with it. And again, I'm a student of comparative literature, and all of us who work in comparative literature know very well that it's not possible to learn every language in the world. We're existentially limited, and so we can learn a few languages, but we are condemned to rely upon the generosity of translators. This is one reason why I myself have devoted so much of my own professional career to performing the work of translation, because I believe it's absolutely essential. All right. So again, this is the place of being, the being that truly is, colorless, shapeless, and untouchable, visible to the mind alone, the soul's pilot and the source of true knowledge. When much time has passed, and she, remember, Psyche is feminized here, and in the story in Apuleius, we're going to see Psyche, the love story between Psyche and Cupid, which tells us about the birth of the soul. Psyche is indeed feminine. And when she, Psyche, looks upon being, she, Psyche, feels adoration when contemplating the truth. She is easily nourished and feels joyous as she looks upon justice itself, and as she looks upon moderation, and as she looks upon knowledge, but not the knowledge where becoming resides, rather the knowledge of the being which really is, the thing that is the thing that it is. Now note here too, in passing, that justice is articulated as an ideal. It's another Platonic innovation that, for instance, when we look at pre-Socratic thinkers like Anaxander, justice is more. We'll come back to this. I just want to mention this in passing now, because this becomes an important theme in the work of Heidegger and Derrida. That justice in its pre-Socratic articulation is dike, which means jointedness. And it's that justice in that sense is about our relationship to others and with the other. And that's not a matter of some sort of Platonic ideal, but it's dike means jointedness, like a joint in a hinge, like in a door hinge. And it's about our relation with actual others who exist in an existential sense. Is that relationship jointed, in joint, or is it out of joint? We'll come back to that. Okay. Now, regarding the fourth madness, erotic love, when someone looks upon earthly beauty and is reminded of the true beauty, again, that he experienced in the realm of being, he acquires wings. And when he tries those wings, eager but unable to take flight, like a bird looking upward, and he shows no concern for the things below, there are reasons to think him touched with madness. This is what Lysias is stigmatizing in the lover. Socrates is saying this is just what it is to be in love. The lover who is hit with this madness is called a lover of beautiful people and beautiful things. All right, so here you see some images of the winged phallus, which was a very common talisman and object that you would find in the ancient world. He's really referring to kind of, he even refers to later, we'll come to a passage where he speaks about the winged pecker. And so it's it's as if, because he's so sexually aroused, he's literally, it's like he's getting an erection, he's getting aroused. It's like he's growing wings because he's so excited. All right, and so here you see again our armillary sphere, and this is, I like this one because you can see it's in Arabic, which shows you again the extent to which this this calculating machine, as I said, was prevalent throughout the ancient world and the medieval world. But you can think of it here as sort of, we think of this winged pecker, or this motion of sailing up to the heavens and getting a glimpse of what is on the other side, which would be the world of being out of the world of becoming. It's as if he's flying up through the circuits, and up to the heavens because of his arousal. All right. Okay. Let's continue. Socrates says, by our very nature, every human soul has already viewed the things which are, but it is not easy for every soul from her earthly perspective to recall those distant things, especially for those souls which saw them briefly, so that when they were turned toward injustice by some company or other here on earth, that is, they naturally forgot the sacred things they had seen there. To be sure, few souls are left from whom that memory is sufficient. All right, so when we're in the company of others and we're drinking and partying, we forget what we experienced in this realm of being. And he says basically, look, that's what the norm is. That's more common to forget what one experiences. But there are some for whom that memory of the experience of the eternal is sufficient. And here he's speaking very specifically about the philosopher. And the philosopher is the one who is able to apprehend this truth in a way that most people are not. He says, whenever they behold an image of the things there, they are thoroughly startled, and they are no longer themselves. This is again love at first sight, and they do not recognize the sensation that they are having because they cannot perceive it sufficiently. There is no shine in the images here on earth of justice and moderation and the other things honorable for souls, but through dim organs of the senses of a few people, and they with difficulty. All right, now note here, again, I've put the alternative translation. This is where we get this phrase, but through a glass darkly. It's another way of translating the same phrase. But I note here again this idea of the shine. This is going to be more characteristic of Aristotelian thought when we think of we think of of a kind of a glow that emanates from the beautiful form. But note here that Aristotle, that this kind of thinking that is more characteristic of the thought of Aristotle is here present in this Platonic dialogue as well. It's as if there is a shine that shines forth, or a radiant light or a glow. This is where we get the idea of a halo that glows forth from the human form. That is what appeals to the to the lover, because he's apprehending. He can't see it directly, and very few can see it at all, except for those who have like the philosophers. But there is something. There's something that is in fact shining forth or glowing forth from within the beautiful form. Formerly, however, it was possible to look upon beauty in its radiance. This is in the realm of being prior to our incarnation in this existence, when in a blessed chorus we dance, we and Zeus's entourage and others in the company of other gods witnessed a blessed sight and spectacle, and we were initiated into what is lawful to call the most blessed of all mysteries. And you can see there a picture of Zeus and his entourage. And this is we have this memory. It is somewhere, within us, Plato's going to say, but we have forgotten it, except when we catch a glimpse of the beautiful person with whom we're in love. Being fully initiated and looking upon whole, simple, unchanging, and blessed visions in pure light. Again, remember we said Greeks are eye people. We were ourselves pure and unmarked by what we now carry around and call a body, a thing which imprisons us like an oyster shell. There's another metaphor of the soul we've discussed previously. Beauty shone brightly in the midst of those visions, and when we came here, we grasped it shining most clearly through the clearest of our senses, because sight is the sharpest of our physical senses, but thought is not seen by it. All right, so here are some, images of Greek statues. There's Venus de Milo in the Louvre in Paris, for instance. I bring these to your attention, and I would urge you to, just look around, just Google Greek statues, look around, because you can see if you study the art, you can get a better sense of what Plato here is talking about. Because you can see here again, as these images don't give us the Greeks weren't interested. They weren't realists, like say Emile Zola, for instance, or Stephen Crane and his Red Badge of Courage. They weren't really interested in showing us the world in all its gritty, ugly, nature. Like, for instance, Joyce and Dubliners, who wants to show us Dear Dirty Dublin. They want to. They're more interested in showing us, the beauty of form, and truth in this sense is the beautiful. Truth discloses itself as the beautiful for the Greeks, and so these are perfect forms. And one of the reasons why Socrates is attracted to Phaedrus is because, as somebody who is older, whose body is in some sense in a stage of degeneration, he looks at Phaedrus and he sees him as a more perfectly realized human form, because he carries the God within him, which again is the same God that Socrates carries within him as well, which they're born under, in some sense, the same star, which he'll identify as the star of Zeus. Now, I mentioned this also in passing. It's just to kind of get an understanding of what we're talking about. And I put the word epistemology here in quotes, Aristotelian epistemology, because this is in some sense anachronistic. Aristotle doesn't really speak of epistemology as such. This is more of a term, modern Kantian term, but it gives you some indication. It's a shortcut, in effect, for thinking about how Aristotle's theory of knowing. How do we know the world of objects or the world of things? How do we know anything at all? And so this can be a kind of a formula that you can remember, much like this formula I gave you earlier of the truly existing intangible essence, something to just kind of keep in mind. Keep these three categories in mind, and I think you can kind of get a sense of how the Greeks thought about truth. And note in the first case. Also, this is in the thought of Thomas Aquinas as well, whom, as I said earlier, is the Christian Aristotelian theologian that Heidegger did his dissertation on. But the first category here you see here is integrity, and this is all things that are essentially in this way of thinking are good because they're suitable to receive a form. So anything that is effectively is good in Greek thinking. Proportion, however, is the suitability, the symmetry of form within the thing, so that if all things that are good because God created them, they aren't necessarily equally symmetrical. Some things are in better, proportion, like the images we saw, for instance, of the discus Thor, who's a perfectly symmetrical form. But at the highest stage of this epistemology, we have this category of clarity, or concept of clarity, in which a radiant light shines forth from within the form. And so this is what Socrates is talking about when he says it's, he sees but through a glass darkly. It's as if a kind of a glow is shining forth or emanating forth. Now this, we've all seen images of halos. This idea we could think of in, let's say, Christian theology, what Aquinas is going to, call the Epiphany, and Joyce will pick up on in his work as well. But an epiphany is a kind of a shining forth that occurs, and this really is what Socrates is talking about. What he sees in the beloved that he is attracted to. All right. when he feels this sort of love at first sight, when he catches a glimpse of this beautiful form. Right? So he says here, Socrates, someone who has amply observed things from the realm of being at first shudders and feels something of those old terrors come over him when he sees a godlike face or any part of the body which is a good imitation of beauty. Later, looking more, he feels reverence as if he were before a god. I mean, when he's standing before the lover, beholding the lover. And if he were not afraid to appear excessively mad, he would sacrifice to his darling boy as if to a statue and a god. As is natural after his cold shudder, a change accompanied by sweat and unaccustomed fever comes over him as he looks at the boy he loves. At the same time, he is warmed as he receives the inflowing of beauty through his eyes. Again, remember we talked about this in the Timaeus, that the beautiful enters into the body through the eyes as light, as fire. In this state, the whole soul boils and throbs violently. That's the same sensation which the soul feels when her wings begin to sprout. Whenever a soul looks at a boy's beauty, she is watered and warmed as she takes in these inflowing and invading draughts of beauty. My beautiful darling boy. Note, Socrates sprinkles his discourse with these flirtatious phrases to Phaedrus, again, to arouse his own erotic desire, but one that's going to be sublated, not acted upon. This passion, which we have been discussing, human beings call love, but when you hear what the gods name it, you will probably laugh because of your youth. Verily, mortals call him winged Eros, but gods call him winged pecker because he makes things rise. Okay, and we already saw an image of the winged pecker that Socrates is referring to here. Okay, now note this is where this next passage we're going to look at is in reference to what we talked about previously as the Greek system being henotheistic rather than monotheistic, in the sense that with the constellations being what they are, and each one of us being born under a particular star, which the star is itself a god. That means that the god created us, and so we have the imprint of that particular deity within us. And so, there are then different kinds of souls because the gods implant different kinds of souls within us. And so Socrates is here, referring to how some of us will feel attraction to some people, others to other people, because we're all created under different stars, in effect. Okay, so let's read. He says, each man walks in the footsteps of his own God, joining in that choral dance, living out his life in honor of that God, and imitating him to the best of his abilities. The followers of Zeus search for a beloved who is noble and Zeus-like in his soul, and they ask whether the beloved is by nature a lover of wisdom and a ruler. Whenever they find him, they fall in love and do everything they can to help him become such a person. All right, so this is what Socrates is saying, in effect, is that his task is to help Phaedrus become that kind of a person, the person who is noble and Zeus-like in his soul. And if he were, as Lysias urges, to act upon his desire for Phaedrus, they would both perhaps experience momentary gratification, but it would be to the detriment of Phaedrus. And Socrates again is doing what he does precisely because he loves Phaedrus not for what he is, but for who he is. There's an image you can see of Zeus, the father god who Socrates is referring to here in this dialogue. Okay, so I'm going to use this kind of metaphor, the Socratic metaphor. So the philosopher is for Socrates, or Socrates sort of sees himself as a, in this dialogue, in his method, as being a kind of a midwife, and his goal is to help Lysias find the truth that is he believes is within Lysias, or the truth that is within himself. All right, and here's his castigation of Lysias. He says, when sophists like Lysias indulge in other kinds of play, finding pleasure in drinking parties and whatever is related to these, which is to say, the sex that happens after everybody gets drunk, the philosopher will engage in, by contrast, will engage in more serious forms of play, not a stigmatized term, but this is the serious, the serious play involved in the dissemination of the truth. It says, when a person uses the dialectical art and selects an appropriate soul, sowing and planting his speeches with knowledge, speeches which have the means to defend themselves, and the one who plants them, these speeches are not fruitless, but bear seed from which other speeches planted in other fields have the means to pass on forever immortal and to make the person possessing them as blessed as humanly possible. And this is Socrates' task, or his goal is to bestow these blessings upon Phaedrus. Okay, so let me say here we're coming to the end of this lecture, and we've surveyed the question of the erotic and its function, how it functions in the Platonic dialectic, and we've said again that Socrates and Plato both see the erotic as an essential aspect of dialectics. Now we're going to see now obviously Socrates we're talking in this case about homosexual desire. But what's going to be, I think what we're going to see is interesting, as we'll continue in the next lecture, is that nonetheless he's going to end up affirming a fairly conservative notion of philosophy as being more akin ultimately to heterosexual intercourse, in the sense that it involves the planting of a seed within the womb, or within the matrix of the soul, the womb, in order to germinate. And so so it's complicated, but we'll explore this more in the next lecture, which will be on what I'm going to call the Phono-logo-centrism of Plato, and we're going to look at that in relation to the thought of Derrida, whose work has been so important in rethinking the phono-logocentric tradition in Western philosophy. Absolutely essential, despite what the theory bashers out there may tell you. So it's really important to attend to Derrida's work in this regard. Now, I'm going to show you here, just as we conclude, what our next lecture is going to be on Plato's phono-logocentrism. And I will quote for you here, quote from Heidegger that we're going to return to in the next lecture. Heidegger is going to say in Being and Time that entities for the Greeks are grasped in their being as presence. This means they are understood with regard to a definite mode of time, the present. And this is a problem or question we're going to begin thinking about in the next lecture when we talk about what we call the metaphysics of presence, which is partly what the task of deconstruction to deconstruct. But I note here, I just to give you kind of a funny little image here to conclude on, you can see there to your right, this is a postcard that Derrida found and was so compelled by that he ended up writing an entire book on this postcard. But in this image, you see here a writing Socrates as opposed to a speaking Socrates, and a Plato standing behind Socrates who is dictating words to Socrates so Socrates can write. This, of course, totally reverses the relationship between Socrates and Plato. But we're going to see too that although Plato in the next in the next lecture on this dialogue is going to constantly be or is going to warn us about the dangers of writing, at the same time, and the virtues of speaking and the importance of presence, the bodies gathered together in time, in the exchanging of interlocutionary dialogue. He nonetheless presents this to us as a dialogue that is written. And so he's constantly doing everything he can to recreate the oral situation of this philosophical exchange. But obviously, at the end of the day, Plato's dialogue too is finally something that is written down. This is a problem that we'll address in the next lecture. So that is all.